Some things are simply too big for us to see, and the emissions of construction industry are one of those things. I claim they are our blind spot in the emissions debate. As an example of that, let's compare it, for instance, to aviation. Everyone knows that flying causes a lot of emissions. In Finland, for example, the term flight chain is widely used, and we have started to favor holiday destinations that require less travel. This is important as flying accounts for 2.5% of total global CO2 emissions. The textile industry is another topic that is often mentioned in debates. Rapidly changing collections, poor quality materials, and environmentally damaging practices, fast fashion, accounts for up to 8% of our total CO2 emissions. But how many of you can tell how much of our CO2 emissions are caused by the built environment? Whose dinner table discussions has the carbon footprint of architecture snuck into? Depending on the calculation method, the figure is around 38%. The number is huge, but the built environment is responsible for 38% of global CO2 emissions. To stay even remotely within the Paris Climate Agreement goal of 1.5 Celsius degree global warming, the total emissions need to be reduced by half by the end of this decade. With such a need to cut emissions, it is not possible to imagine that the way we comprehend and produce the built environment could stay anywhere near the same as it is now. In the construction industry, it is tempting to think that by making building materials more environmentally friendly and using sustainable energy, we can continue business as usual. It's tempting to believe that new technologies will solve everything. While the development of new materials and technologies is of course important, it's not a holistic solution as long as we keep building more and more. The challenge of construction is a global one, but the ways of approaching and solving the problem vary from place to place. The scale of the disruption requires that we are ready to challenge what we understand as architecture in the future. And in Western countries, where there already is enough building stock in most areas, the answer lies in the hierarchy of building. Let me share my understanding of how the construction industry and architecture need to be approached. Let's start with the way architecture is perceived today. When I tell people I am an architect, they usually imagine me designing new, big, shiny buildings. And to be honest, that is currently what it is mostly about for most architects. While new construction will not disappear from the architectural toolkit, the role it plays will change significantly. When new buildings are indeed necessary, they will primarily be built using recycled building components from demolished buildings, and where virgin materials are needed, bio-based materials such as straw, clay or wood will be preferred. The new building should be suitable for diverse purposes, adaptable for future needs, easily repairable and designed for effortless dismantling. But in fact, this should be the very last option and the lowest level of the new hierarchy of building, which we will only resort when all other options have been explored. One step closer to best practice would be to extend and integrate. Rather than building a whole new building, we will strive to maximize the use of existing structures by extending buildings within the current built environment. Sometimes there is a need for more space and new functions. Instead of responding with a new building, we need to look at the synergies that building a new facility can bring to an existing one. Let's use a primary school as a case example. The local school holds sports classes on an outdoor beach. At the same time, the nearest gym and playing court for the residents is in the neighboring district. As the existing school already has changing rooms and lobbies and even a cafeteria, Instead of building separate public sport facility, could we integrate them into the existing school building? Most important here is that tapping into existing infrastructure allows us to utilize existing networks and public transportation, preserving the natural environment and its biodiversity. But even infill is new construction. The most sustainable building is the one that already exists, and thus we must always prioritize the renovation and transformation of the buildings we already have. When possible, buildings should be maintained in their original use because it allows for less extensive renovations and adaptations. Apartments remain apartments, school as schools, etc. However, societal needs change over time, sometimes requiring significant renovations or even changes in use. Let's get back to our school building as an example. Over the decade, the demographics within the school district has changed, and there are no longer enough children for a big school. And at the same time, there are more elderly people than ever. Instead of tearing down the school and building a new assisted living facility, we should adapt the existing building to meet these new needs. But often, the wheel doesn't need to be reinvented. The fourth level is care and maintenance. This idea challenges the modern day ideal of maintenance free. In current construction, maintenance free is considered a positive because we think it reduces costs. However, as no material is eternal, maintenance free also means unrepairable. In the future, as materials become more scarce and expensive and carbon budget become part of the overall equation, there will also be more incentive for maintenance. Instead of ridding ourselves of the needs to maintain, the focus will shift to continuous maintenance. When facilities are constantly well cared for and looked after, in the long run, the number of required major renovations and most importantly, replacements is reduced. Going back to our school example, traditionally, care could be painting the facades or patching the leaking roof. But in addition to this, maintenance is also small everyday acts, such as closing the windows on a rainy day. As you may have guessed, the pinnacle of architecture of the future is making use of existing and underused spaces as they are, hardly doing anything at all to the physical environment. The most important step to sustainable architecture is to see the potential of these spaces and envision new ways for their use. At the moment, we have a lot of spaces that are only occupied part-time. The fact that we simultaneously maintain, heat and cool, separate facilities for activities for a certain time of day or a certain time of the year, for example, multiplies the required natural resources to provide the same services. One last time, let's revisit our primary school building as an example. When pupils go home in the afternoon, the school bell goes silent. However, in the evenings, the music class could be used by a senior citizens choir and the auditorium turned into a public cinema. So, when you need a new facility, the first step is to look at existing spaces and see if they could meet those needs. So, to conclude, we need to move up the hierarchy and minimize actions on the lower levels. This means making the higher level issues the very core of architecture, the new default. In the future, looking back on the architecture of the early 21st century, we will be astonished. What is currently business as usual will be considered as the very last option. Most construction activities will no longer be about building, but about cherishing, appreciating, and loving what exists. This, however, does not mean less design, less creativity, or fewer interesting questions. In fact, the opposite is true. In the future, the design challenge will be to achieve the best and most inspiring solutions with the smallest alterations and least amount of material. I, for one, couldn't be more eager to embrace this challenge.